Long before the days of Roman Emperor Nero Claudius and Hakuno battling for the Holy Grail in the moon cell amongst the cast of Fate Extra, and even before King Arturia unsheathing her ultimate weapon, Avalon alongside Shiro in the Fate route, we had what was in all intents and purposes Type Moon's first boy meets girl concept in Double Blue Glass Moon under the Crimson Airs, Tsukihime. But before we can talk about Tsukihime, there's an intrinsic and fascinating roadmap of tales that help to better establish just why Tsukihime, in essence, is so important and why the conception of what led to the genesis of one story leading to another is so important. You see, this is not the story of Tsukihime, but rather the story before Tsukihime. Which is why, in order to fully understand the origins of Tsukihime, it is essential to examine the series of events that contributed to the foundational elements necessary for its inception. First and foremost, one must take a step back and look at what is fundamentally rooted in its framework and not just at face value. Doing so would result in inquiring about the many works within its genre and subgenre that help to build the foreground on which Tsukihime will later claim its importance. These works cover a wide range of literary fiction genres and contain the fundamental resources that made this titular creation possible. Hence why when looking at the building blocks of an aboriginal series such as Tsukihime, it is essential to examine the sources that the creator used as inspiration, the rationale behind the choice of literary medium, the traits that characterize said literary medium, and lastly, the circumstances that caused these specific works to become a crucial part of the development of the creation's identity as it is currently understood in the present day. In essence, the objective of this video will be to provide the necessary answers to the questions I pose, which in turn will help to establish the literary contributions, both direct and indirect, that shaped the foundations of Tsukihime. An extensive look into the foundations of Tsukihime takes us back to the early 19th century, the year 1816 to be precise, where the perception of the vampire will be revolutionized into the perspective in which we most commonly associate him with today. While the concept of the vampire had been recognized globally for centuries, his portrayal has often differed significantly from contemporary interpretations. In traditional mythology, the vampire is depicted as a decayed creature, often hideously mangy and grotesque, devoid of the alluring charm, noble lineage, and the seductive semblance that characterizes the modern vampire. Some of the vampires best exemplifying the former notion would include the infamous Kurt Barlow from Salem's Lot, the master vampire from Dracula Untold, and most famously the Bram Stoker directly inspired vampire from Nosferatu, Count Orlok. These depictions obviously come in direct contrast to the vampires best represented in the latter description, of which can best be exemplified by the iconic Jerry Dandridge from Fright Night, Damon Salvatore from the Vampire Diaries series, Lestat de Leonco from Interview with the Vampire, and lastly the head vampire Maxwell Lawrence from The Lost Boys. Now you may be asking what factors contributed to the transformation in his depiction, as well as how it relates to Tsukihime in general. Well, in regards to both questions, it is essential that we have a good understanding of the vampire's history, because with it comes the realization of how its progression ultimately led to what we have with our main heroine in Arcuid. That is because at its core, Tsukihime presents a narrative centered around vampire mythology, framed within the broader context of good versus evil. Now, one can include the mysticism associated with the elite and the church, the whodunit mystery element involved in the murders, the dichotomy between life and death, the facet Natsu himself pointed out, which is the boy meets girl story, and what I consider its most important theme, the contrasting aspects of love and loss. But nonetheless, the essential premise of my argument remains that the narrative, along with its subsequent developments, cannot transcend its fundamental essence as a vampire story. Consider, for an instance, a scenario in which Arcuid is portrayed not as a vampire, but as a girl simply blessed with extraordinary abilities, while the undead are merely presented as zombies and not undead vampires. While this alteration may initially appear minor, a deeper analysis reveals its significant implications to the overall narrative, particularly during key moments, such as the critical moment on day 10, which fundamentally depends on Arcue's existence as a vampire for its effectiveness. So while it may seem unrelated to a video referencing Tsukihime, the history of the vampire is very much the history of Arcued, and after this video hopefully you'll be able to see just how complementary the connection is. With all this in mind, let us now endeavor into the historical origins of the modern vampire's legacy by traveling to the year I previously mentioned as a preeminent point. In the year 1816, otherwise known as the Year Without Summer, a collection of distinguished poets, including the esteemed Lord Byron and his physician, the equally skilled poet John William Polidori, convened at an exquisite villa in Switzerland. Given the revolutionizing events in mind, which involved an erupting volcano in Indonesia, directly affecting the atmosphere and leaving the citizens of the nearby locations confined to their indoors, these events basically prompted the aristocrats to engage in a creative challenge. One night, as the rain fell on their villa, they read from a ghost stories novel titled Phantasmagoria, which prompted the renowned poet Lord Byron to assert the group to participate in a friendly competition to craft their own original ghost tales. Sources surrounding what Polidori did vary, but it is noted by a fellow poet at the gathering he wrote a rather uninteresting story about a woman with a skull head. Displeased with his first attempt at the challenge, Polidori transformed his setback into a source of inspiration, as when challenged to expand upon Lord Byron's unfinished portrayal of a noble vampire, he took it upon himself to prove that his master's underdeveloped story could in fact work. Utilizing his mentor's incomplete manuscript, extract of a letter from Geneva, as a foundation, Polidori crafted his notable novella, The Vampire, which drew upon the lived experiences of both himself and Lord Byron, reflecting their highly esteemed background. Recall that I previously mentioned the vampire wasn't yet relegated to a formal background. He was still at this time just a beast that preyed on the innocents. So what Lord Byron, and in repercussion, Polidori did was indeed revolutionary, and could really only work given their statuses as noble men. Skipping forward a bit to after the release of The Vampire, one might presume that Polidori's publication of this work would have secured him widespread recognition. However, this was not the case. After finalizing the novella, Polidori, perhaps out of sheer ignorance, left it at the residence of a fellow noble, Countess Catherine Bruce, where it remained unpublished for 2 to 3 years depending on the source, before it was discovered and released, with the authorship attributed to none other than Lord Byron. It is unknown exactly how his script ended up at the publishing residence, but it is noted that every single script written by the poets during that summer was bundled together. Thus, it can be presumed it wasn't out of a direct form of thievery, but more so a common mistake. Regardless of the reason, the bundles of scripts ended up where they needed to be in order to be published, and regardless if it were true or not, Lord Byron would be credited as the writer. Thus, upon learning of the publication of The Vampire, Polidori endeavored to reclaim his authorship, with mixed results, as some publications did manage to remove Byron's name but still leave Polidori as the author completely out of authorship as well. Eventually, he would succeed in this regard, while also retaining a fragment from Byron in the preface. However, his recognition was overshadowed by the prevailing belief that Byron was the true author. I should add that some scholars have made the argument that Polidori actually wrote his epic novella years after the Switzerland outing, which would make the disownment of his authorship to The Vampire all the more disheartening. Consequently, Polidori would pass away at the tender age of 26, impoverished and disheartened, a story likened to the grim outcomes of famous poets in history such as Edgar Allan Poe or H.P. Lovecraft. Now, while this marked the end of his life, it laterally signified the beginning of the vampire's legacy, as the novella quickly gained popularity throughout Europe and inspired theatrical adaptations, as well as possible ties in influencing many vampiric-themed works. Thus, the legend of the modern vampire was born, a poignant narrative emerging from a tale of tragedy, where one life ended, the life of another was born. A genuine masterpiece indeed. With the origin story of the modern vampire revealed, the next stop in our journey of this prelude takes us to the most notable after effect of the newly formed vision for Dracula, 1958, where a film would emerge that greatly influenced the individual who would inspire Natsu. This film, recognized not only as a cornerstone of the horror genre, but also as a landmark in the broader landscape of media, introduced talents that would transform many classic films we revere today. With a cast including Peter Cushing of Star Wars fame, Sir Christopher Lee of Lord of the Rings and Star Wars fame, and lastly Michael Gough of Batman fame. Horror of Dracula premiered, establishing itself as arguably the most iconic portrayal of the Count to date, thanks to the remarkable performances of its cast and its relative faithfulness to Bram Stoker's seminal novel, Dracula. While an in-depth analysis of the novel would be appealing, my focus here will primarily be on the film adaptation, as it is the version directly referenced by Hideaki Kikuchi, the creator I previously foreshadowed as the primal influence on Natsu. The narrative horror of Dracula unfolds in Klausenburg, centering on the character of Dr. Van Helsing, who journeys to Castle Dracula in search of his friend, Jonathan Harker, who had mysteriously disappeared after taking a position as Dracula's personal curator. Upon reading Harker's journal, it is revealed that his true purpose for being there was to confront and eliminate Dracula, whose legend appears to be a widely known problem amongst the populace. This is evidenced by the residents' practice of hanging garlic, a well-known traditional safeguard against vampires, which, funny enough, was actually made famous by the novel. Upon Van Helsing's arrival at Castle Dracula, he discovers Harker's remains, which bear bite marks on the neck, signifying that Harker is unable to transition to the afterlife. In a compassionate act, Van Helsing drives a stake through Harker's heart, allowing him to pass on in peace. And with this objective now cleared, Van Helsing proceeds to inform Harker's fiancée, Lucy, along with her family consisting of her brother, Arthur, and his wife, Mina, about Harker's demise. It is during this visit he discovers that Dracula has shown an interest in Harker's lineage, as evidenced by the bite marks on Lucy, which the family had mistaken for anemia. It's important to note that while it isn't referenced in the movie, the novel hints that because Jonathan Harker killed one of his brides, Dracula went after his bride in order to make her one of his own, showing his twisted mentality for revenge, and also highlighting something about the Count that would also stay as part of his character across his many interpretations, and his nature of having 3 brides. We do also notice he goes after those who embody pureness and tend to be those of good heart. With that small interlude out of the way, I'll continue with the movie synopsis. Whilst Van Helsing tries his best to keep Lucy safe, he is unable to when it's discovered she had passed away the following morning. After noticing the fang marks on her neck, Van Helsing tells the family the truth about her death being done by the hands of a vampire. While skepticism arose, their horror would come to reality when reports of a young girl seeing Lucy's ghostly image prompts Van Helsing and Arthur to visit her tomb. There she appears and attacks them, but succumbs to the powers of the cross before being staked in order to pass on, just as her fiancé had endured. It's then, when the 2 men gone, that Mina is bitten by Dracula, that the tensions arise, as it seems he is trying to get rid of the entire family one by one like a wild beast. Luckily for Mina, however, it is established that it takes time in order to transform. So with the help of a blood transfusion, she is able to withstand the influence of Dracula and remain human. But as I noted, this is only for a short period of time. Nevertheless, when Van Helsing and Arthur do however manage to find the tomb of Dracula in the wine cellar, the wheels are set in motion for the chase, as Dracula abducts Mina in order to have her completely turn into a vampire. Meeting back at Castle Dracula, before he succeeds in burying Mina, Van Helsing confronts the Count and they have a final face-off in his castle, making it the more impactful as they are battling on the same grounds upon which John Harker was first bitten. Despite his overwhelming strength, the power of the cross once again proves too much, and with the combination of the sunlight, Dracula is defeated and the vampiric curse is lifted from Mina, thus ending the story of horror of Dracula. While watching this movie now, one could see it as nothing more than an old, behind-the-times campy vampire movie. However, for one Hideyuki Kikuchi, it would become the centerpiece to his novelization career that would lead him to become one of the most recognized authors in Japan. Hideyuki Kikuchi, for those unaware, is the legendary author who primarily focuses on the horror genre and is most famous for the two works that relate to the subject of this video: Demon City Shinjuku and, most importantly, Vampire Hunter D. Demon City Shinjuku, for those who may not know, was actually the series that Takeuchi Takashi, the artist for Natsu and current president of Type Moon, was heavily inspired by and attempted to get his friend Natsu into. Funny enough, at the time, apparently Natsu wasn't into novels, which is quite ironic considering his greatest works are novel related. But nonetheless, being a manga fan still led him into the world of Kikuchi through Demon City Hunter. Demon City Hunter being a manga continuation of the Demon City Shinjuku series as an after event, focused on defending the city from a rampant demon takeover. It was this story and this recommendation that led to Natsu finding his adoration for the novels of Kikuchi. While in search of more series to delve into, he would find his inspiration's masterpiece, Vampire Hunter D. This can be seen as a novel with the biggest impact on Natsu, as it's when he stated he felt he could be a novelist himself, and one can see the influence in Tsukihime from Vampire Hunter D. To tie things back into the previous discussion revolving with Bram Stoker's creation, one only has to simply open the Dark Horse translated novels to the foreword, where Kikuchi directly states, "For the cast and crew of Horror of Dracula," and in an interview with Film Star, in reference to the inspiration of D, I quote, "He was based on Christopher Lee's interpretation of Count Dracula, so his unearthly beauty was intended to land the female fans, and it worked, thus solidifying how impactful Horror of Dracula was." Now, of course, when looking at the characters, while the inspiration is there, a great creator does not simply borrow previous works and copy/paste them. They tend to add their twists into the creation to make it inherently theirs, which is exactly what Kikuchi did. By reimagining the narrative framework of the vampire, Kikuchi positioned D, the main character of his series, who is half vampire, as a heroic protagonist, diverging from the archetype of the charismatic villain, which had been popularized by Christopher Lee and Bram Stoker. This novel approach significantly expanded the potential narratives within vampire mythology, as now one could position the vampire to stand against his fellow creepers of the night in the pursuit of justice. This concept basically formed the integral aspect of D in the Vampire Hunter novels, which in turn would influence what we are fans of now, primarily in regards with the creation of Arcuid Brunstad. Arcuid's existence as a vampire, characterized by a lack of human interaction in contemporary society and perceived as an entity devoid of life, becomes more comprehensible when one examines the established traits of vampire mythology up to that point. Similar to Count Dracula, Arcuid hails from a noble lineage, predominantly residing in a castle, and possesses a surface-level understanding of the general populace, which enables her to navigate social atmospheres while simultaneously maintaining an air of distinction. Ponder for a moment the characters of Dracula and D. Dracula embodies the image of a prosperous individual, typical of his era. However, there is still that underlying mysterious quality about him that sets him apart from the European populace. Similarly, D presents himself in a cowboy aesthetic, of which, funny side note, I can't fully confirm, but an interesting fact I've seen flown around online forums states that Kikuchi was inspired by the appearance of Phil Collins from his hit video Don't Lose My Number when conceptualizing D's design. Regardless of whether it's true or not, my point is D manages to seamlessly integrate himself into the Western cowboy surroundings while simultaneously maintaining a striking presence that makes him undoubtedly noticeable. Arcuid is very much the same way, with the most obvious aspect being her Western appearance as a female in the East. This is in part because Takeuchi used an American model, a Canadian to be specific, as her template. In addition to this is her choice of apparel. While most of the cast consists of characters in the generic school or occupational attire, Arcuid has a distinct dress-up, donning a white long sleeve to complement her white skin. a long purple skirt, purple being a color that used to signify nobility, and dark cherry red eyes. Definitely doesn't sound like the typical Japanese woman, or even so, one that would fit along with the Tsukihime cast. And yet when you consider that she's been around the city hunting the vampires and was only noticed by Shiki thanks to his abilities, you can see the similar approach used here that worked for Dee and Dracula. Appearance aside, there's a lot more in terms of her evolution to the greater vampire lore. As I detailed, the vampire archetype went from a symbol of ultimate malevolence to a heroic figure, while in this narrative, the vampire is additionally portrayed as a female character, a shift reminiscent of the portrayal in the novel Carmilla and the movie Fright Night 2. However, it's important to note that in both these works, the female vampire still served as the primary antagonist rather than the protagonist, of which Arcuate embodies. For this next segment, we are going to be looking into what is essentially the final piece in the foundational literary aspect, specifically the decision to utilize the visual novel as the selected medium. Up to now, we've established how the story of the vampire transformed and has continually been enhanced in ways where it's still relative, but dissonant enough to feel new and unique. Likewise, the decision for Natsu taking his talents to the visual novel realm in a way fits with this narrative of continued advancement. You may or may not be aware, but Natsu's first official work that is associated with Taimon is in fact the Garden of Sinners novels. So when the opportunity came for his next work, it would only make sense to go a step further. You see, while at face value the visual novel may seem like nothing more than basically reading a novel online with a mouse for choice selection, a deeper inquiry into the medium leads to the realization of how extensive the possibilities and the impact those decisions have within the overall narrative can be. In essence, it encapsulates the true meaning of escapism, which is the ability to leave the norms of our day-to-day life in order to seek the pleasures of the fictional life. While this can be done through any form of media, the escapism element is most aligned with the gaming scene. On this occasion, while some may not agree with it, the visual novel technically falls under the category for a game. See, even in its early establishment, the often quoted pioneer of visual novels, Yuji Horii, acquired his inspiration to make the Portopia serial murder case, which is cited as the first visual novel, by looking at adventure games from the West. As Yuji Horii would state, I read an article in a PC magazine about a US computer game genre called adventure games, which allowed players to read stories on their PCs. We still didn't have them in Japan, and I took it upon myself to make one. We can gather from this citation that Horii got his idea for the visual novel through the concept of games that allowed the player to essentially decide the story via the actions they made along the way, similar to a board game RPG, which is exactly what Horii made a big proponent in his work. You weren't just playing a linear novel, the actions made in time directly affect the current trajectory of the story, as well as any and all future possible selections within the eventual ending. With all this information in mind, it's clear to see how this and the preceding material led to creators wanting to take advantage of the ever-growing popularity in home computers, which directly coincided with the gaming scene and the ability of being able to make a long form of literature that had the benefit of such things such as constant images and music in the background to keep the readers and players engaged. All this to say, when you consider how complex of a story writer Natsu was, something as significant as the visual novel made all the sense in the world. If you read some of Natsu's translated interviews, he often talks about being boxed in with writing assignments, where he had a page limit or word count to follow. It can be stressful to basically limit the imaginative potential in your brain in order to conform to formal standards. Another thing to consider is that the popularity of at-home computers was beginning to take over, and so if you wanted an individual to buy your product, you needed that person committed to the story and willing to come back for more, which can be hard to do when reading novels, since it is easy to lose track. In contrast, visual novels offer a more immersive experience, as the continuous presentation of images and the inclusion of interactive choices enhance reader satisfaction and maintain engagement throughout the entire narrative. And thus, this is why, in my opinion, after reading the words of Natsu, the visual novel was the only logical medium to make his potentially breakout series. The concluding segment of our discussion pertains to what can be regarded as the final component of this intricate puzzle we've been unraveling. Having explored the historical context of vampires, the impact of vampire-centric narratives on Tsukihime, and the rationale behind its release as a visual novel, we are left with one pivotal question. Who would be the revolutionary individuals responsible for synthesizing all these elements together to bring Tsukihime to fruition? The answer is quite obviously Type Moon. But just who is Type Moon? Or rather, what is Type Moon? That is the question. Much like we did with the narrative of the vampire, we go to the beginning of Type Moon, taking us to the early childhood days of Kenoku Natsu and Takashi Takeuchi. Type Moon's origins diverge significantly from conventional company accounts that typically feature established creators collaborating to form a team. Instead, their journey began long before they would even think about embarking on a successful production career. During their middle school years, the duo immersed themselves in many different genres of literature, while simultaneously engaging in the creative pursuits, with the heavy emphasis on manga and novels, with Kikuchi's work standing out as particularly influential for both individuals. So much so that I have to reiterate again, it was only after reading the novels of Kikuchi that Natsu thought to himself that this could be a part of his future, and a part of his future it would become. As the duo remained friends and committed to exploring the creative world, they coalesced to form a doujin circle, calling themselves Bamboo Broom. And it was in these years as a doujin circle within the markets that they would become inspired to try their hand at the ever-growing visual novel, a task that would see them have to expand their resources should they take it seriously, which is exactly what they did, as the addition of 2 new members allowed them to transform into what we know them best for now, which is Type Moon, consisting of Natsu as the writer, Takeuchi as the artist, Kyobe as the programmer, and Kate handling the music. Their task was simple in concept, but difficult in execution. Faced with challenges including time limitations, insufficient rest, a small team, and the risk of project failure, the team demonstrated unwavering determination and pursued all possible options to achieve their goal. Natsu notably mentioned that he resigned from his job to dedicate himself fully to the game, with financial backing from his childhood friend Takeuchi, highlighting their mutual dedication to the endeavor. With this hard work and dedication to see the end result through, after a little over a year, the light at the end of the tunnel would shine. Just before the dawn of the year 2000, Tsukihime was released, and while in hindsight, it didn't make as big of an impact as Fate Stay Night would in the future, it nonetheless received remarkable praise for its enchanting storytelling that adeptly combined elements of despair and serenity, as well as, most importantly, the themes of love and loss. This was a massive success for the team, as Natsu would state, their sole purpose for coming together was Tsukihime. So with it being done, their time together would be as well, or so it should have been. But thanks to the immense dedication and time devoted to this project, its success fostered a sense of unity amongst the team, prompting them to embark on further endeavors with Tsukihime serving as the foundation. Well, that about brings us to the end. I do hope you enjoyed this short look into the aspect of the vampire, the visual novel, and Type Moon's formation. While the Foundations of Tsukihime in here, it is only the beginning of my quest in examining and analyzing the story upon which I will be doing in upcoming videos. If it seems like I skipped over in identifying the aspects of the information learned that pertain to the actual story, rest assured, those will be pointed out in the actual Tsukihime videos. This was simply an experimentation to tell the essential elements that help to form the narrative and not an analysis or review of the actual story. I'd like to point out this is my first ever endeavor into the realm of YouTube, so if you have any criticism or suggestions, please don't be afraid to leave them in the comments, as I hope to gain a lot of experience in this initial project. So yeah, if you enjoyed this type of content, rest assured I'll be making much more, and with that being said, thank you for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye.